Okay.
Good morning and afternoon and evening, everyone. I use that to say that time is kind of an invention, and quite frankly, it's even tomorrow in Australia. So kind of ponder that. We have these ways of delineating reality, but also it's flexible and changeable. Not to mention we had before Christ and after Christ, and I'm not even sure how that ever happened in terms of getting the various countries to unify around that 2,000 or so years ago. My guest this morning afternoon and evening is the Honorable Clifton Graves, who's a retired probate judge here in Connecticut. But I was talking to Cliff earlier that we've known each other and bumped into each other. I can't remember the first time that we've seen each other, but he attended gunnery school and then Tufts and graduated from Georgetown Law, ran for mayor here in New Haven. He's very much involved with one of our local churches, Dixwell United Church of Christ, in terms of its leadership structure and its restructuring. It's taught at Gateway Community College. I guess Cliff, it was Gateway Tech. What was the name? It was a different name before you started teaching there before it was even Gateway.
Um, yeah, I think it was still South
But
Central.
yes, the South Central Community College, uh,
Morphed
and
into, yes, yeah,
and then worked at Southern Connecticut University, also in
yes,
affirmative action. Also was very much involved with Amistad, the Amistad Freedom Schooner, um, and
yeah,
just a good guy. And also has some health challenges. I'm not going to put him on blast, but I'm always tempted to mention that we all have health challenges, and both Cliff and I are AARP eligible, so we've been around the track a few years. And it's
yeah.
important for every Black man when he hears and sees us to kind of realize that your health is your wealth. But Cliff, good morning, afternoon, and evening to you.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time zone we're in. But thank you, Tom, and for giving me this opportunity to vent and rant a little. But
Well,
you
that's it.
for your service and your edification of our community on a wide variety of issues, and your service as an older person as well. Thank you, sir.
Well, we're not going to talk about this last reincarnation, but I will say since you brought that up that I thought I knew a lot and I thought I was a genius before becoming an elected official, but
Yeah,
being an elected official can humble you.
absolutely.
And some people see it to be an edification of their ego. For me, it's been and I'll just conclude on this, an eye-opening blessing
Yeah,
about the intricacies of life, but also generally people still want to see things happen in a good way. But how do you kind of create that uniform good way versus the divisive good way? It's been very fascinating, the psychology of people, but I'm enjoying the experience. And I'm glad you lifted that up.
I absolutely appreciate you because public service is a calling, but it can be very very challenging as you're finding out. It can be, but the rewards I think still outweigh the shortcomings. The rewards
It,
and benefits, I think still outweigh.
indeed, and it depends on where you place your value, because the rewards do not have to be and should not be perceived to be tangible rewards, but there's so many intangible rewards, and I think we all need to kind of focus on that's what should give you life and breath and purpose and reason for
Absolutely,
being.
absolutely, no question about it. And I, and it's just and so you mentioned several things in terms of just public service. I've been very fortunate and blessed, as you know, some of my story that my family moved here from North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, my father's home. I was born in Oklahoma, my mother's home. When I was a teenager, Reverend Edmonds, the late Reverend Dr. Edwin Edmonds, who was a historic figure in this community, legendary civil rights, human rights activist, was a dear friend of my parents, and he persuaded my father to come here, take a job, and work at the church in an economic development capacity. The church had at that time, Dixwell had an arts center at the Dixwell United Church of Christ, at Dixwell Avenue United Church of Christ, an arts center, an economic development arm, a housing development corporation. And so my father was brought in to help run that particular aspect of the church um, ministry. And so, and of course, being a Southern boy, went straight to, I was able to get a scholarship, awarded a scholarship to what was called then gunnery prep school. Now it's Mr. Gun School up in Washington, Connecticut, which is about 50 miles from in the boonies from New Haven. But it was a great experience for me, a cultural shock for me in many ways. But for a lot of ways we can get into a little later. But it was eye opening in many ways and helped guide me and direct me to many ways to where I am now. From there to Tufts University and then Tufts to Georgetown Law. And since that time, the last, I guess, 40, almost 50 years, a wide array of opportunities. I've been very fortunate and blessed with from working in for the most part in public sector, which is what I wanted to do. And I really had never had a real desire to work in the private sector. Although everyone else in my family has, I was the only one I think that maintained stayed the course in the public sector. Sometimes to my regret, but for the most part, I have no real regrets about that. In terms of whether it was the public, whether it was at the city government, I worked for 4 different mayors in New Haven. As a lawyer, as administrator. I worked at the Housing Authority as a counsel there. I worked at Southern Connecticut State University, as you mentioned, as an administrator. Worked certainly at Gateway. I've taught at Gateway for over 20 years. And the only that version I had was when I worked at Amistad America, which was a nonprofit, but still kind of it was more like still a quasi public entity outreach because of what Amistad has meant historically to this community. So I've been very fortunate and blessed to have those opportunities presented to me. And you're right, Tom. You mentioned about your service as an alder. What I found and listen, none of us are perfect. I say often, as Jesse Jackson would always say, we're public servants, not perfect servants. We're public, not perfect servants. So we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna screw up. We're gonna make bad decisions, wrong decisions, along the way. But as long as your heart's in the right place, and I think during the course, I look back on my career, I've made a whole lot of mistakes, a lot of things I've regretted that I could have done, should have done better. And even this last venture as probate judge, I'm sure that I'd like to think I made some pretty good decisions, but I also know I feel in my heart of hearts that I could have done things differently. But that's life. That's who you are. That's what you do, and you try to live for another day. But I believe again, as if your heart's in the right place and you try to do the right thing, people will respect you, even if they disagree with you. As long as they feel you're making the right decision in your heart or in your head, as long as you get the respect, I think that's ultimately what matters, and you make a difference. So, and that's what I've been trying to do: just be a difference maker, a change agent, because of the way I was raised by my parents, and certainly by folks like Doc Edmonds and many others along the way. Justice Louis Harper Jr., who made me still today is I consider a mentor. Tony Walker, Reverend Edmonds' daughter, who's as you know, who's probably arguably the most powerful Black woman in state government as chair of the Appropriations Committee in the State House. We've known each other since we were babies, literally since we were babies, because of the parents' relationship. I've been very fortunate to have folk like that in my life, and they give me guidance and direction and support when I needed it. You mentioned the church. The church family at Dixwell has been there for me through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And of course, then my family. I have 2 sisters and a brother, and of course my two children, and a bunch of other extended family members here in Connecticut and North Carolina and Oklahoma, who've been there for me. And so that I can't, but all those I have a bunch of regrets like most people, but not many. I'm, like you said, the fact that we're still here. I'll be 71 in a little over a month, and that's a blessing. There are a lot of do health a lot, and I appreciate you for highlighting it. And you've been staying on me about eating right and exercising, because I am diabetic. As you mentioned, that's something I'm not proud of, but it's something that as a health issue for Black men especially, something we need to be cognizant of, and I need to do better on that myself. But the fact that I'm still here is a blessing, and I know a lot of folks who are not, who are here, day, who were here a year ago, who are not here for different reasons. And so, for whatever reason, you're here and I'm still here. That means that God, the force above, had decided our work is not through yet. We still got something to do before we world. And so, whatever that might be, Tom, for you, for me, we got to stick with it, be steadfast in our commitment to do right and be right and make a difference.
Definitely, appreciate your mentioning that. And when you referenced, Cliff, when you mentioned Oklahoma, just as you know, I've been sending greetings out to folks this week about just saying Happy Native Day, not really specifying Thursday and not really specifying Friday. In some ways, today is kind of a national day of mourning as well. And even in terms of Thanksgiving, certainly we have celebrated that. Many cultures, including the Black culture, have celebrated Thanksgiving as a time for a family gathering. But in a strange way, Cliff, unless in my mind, if we just remind ourselves that even for us to say Thanksgiving from a family gathering standpoint, we're still appropriating and quite frankly not honoring the tragedy that occurred. It's kind of still a dismissal of the. I'm kind of an original person theory wise, not in terms of former Supreme Court Justice Scalia, but I do believe in sometimes original reasons are good to kind of be remembered. So we certainly have a lot to give thanks for. Just want to ask you briefly about the situation in the Middle East, and I know you may not have traveled there, but I've been sharing that with asking people that question because it's on, I think, our hearts, mind, and soul. And I'll kind of direct it this way to you, Cliff. You're in touch with if you were in your class. I'm assuming you guys are on a break now from Gateway. I'm thinking, and you're back in early December, perhaps.
No, actually, well, I won't go back into January.
Until January. So in January, what would you say to some? And we don't know how the outcome is going to be with the hostages are released. But what would you like to say to students in January about this? We'll have passed December in January, but the peace on earth, goodwill toward women, men, and children. What would you like to say to them to kind of make that more of just a buzzword, but more of a reality in their generation, in their next generation?
Well, we actually on that. Well, before we get to that, if you don't mind, let me go back to the indigenous issue, if you don't mind, just quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, right. I was born in Oklahoma, my mother's home. And you've heard me tell the story about my great grandfather, Neely Factor, who was one of the first African American United States deputy marshals in American history. He served with Bass Reeves, who has a television show now, as you know, on one of the stations, I can't remember, but on Netflix there. But my great grandfather was a hero, but he spoke 6 different indigenous languages. He was part Choctaw himself, out of our family. So part of our family heritage on my mother's side in particular, but both my mother's father and mother, had indigenous blood, and even on my father's side, my paternal side, my grandmother had Cherokee and Seminole. So that connection, and I teach this in my African American history class. I talk about the interconnection historically between African Americans and indigenous folk. No matter where we were, where we lived, there was the general philosophy was the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so we both had common enemies, and as you know historically, and that in many ways brought the various indigenous tribal nations together with Africans, and it's carried down to this very day, right here in Connecticut, as you know. So it's important you talk about this week in particular. Even at church last week, we took a moment, as I think as many churches did, to pay homage to our indigenous heritage and the fact that many of us have indigenous blood running through our veins, but more importantly, or just as importantly, the fact that this country, as it celebrates this weekend, as you know, that holiday itself, if you want to call it that, was appropriated from indigenous people, and so who were backstabbed as a result of that, and they're taken advantage of. So that's part of our history and heritage we have to teach. So, and that kind of segues into your question about the police. So I'll leave that alone for a moment. But come to your question. So here's the thing: I mentioned when I moved here at 15, moved to Connecticut from North Carolina. Honestly, I got to tell you, going to North Carolina, there were just two races, black and white. Didn't know anything about Italians. Didn't know anything about Irish. Didn't know anything about Jewish people. Quite frankly, in the South, in the South I grew up in the early '60s, it was just black and white. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if your skin complexion was white, or give you a Caucasian, and we didn't know, we didn't really care what your ethnic background was because everybody we was the enemy. That's
Mm-hmm.
why were against us. So it wasn't until I moved to Connecticut and went to attend the Gunnery Prep School, and people started telling me, "Oh well, I'm so and so, with a vowel in my name that I'm Italian heritage, or if I'm O'Brien, I'm Irish, or if I'm Bernstein, I'm Jewish." And I began to say, "Oh, gee," and began to see the differences and distinctions in the histories. I began to learn, had to learn on the fly about these various cultures and the histories that they brought to this country, and certainly, and in particular, we had one Muslim student at the school out of 220 folks at the time, and he was from India, by the way. He wasn't from India; he
Mm-hmm.
was Indian Muslim, and so and of course, and it was interesting. He gravitated toward the African American students because he said, "I feel more in common with you brothers than everybody else."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because he was Muslim, and there were several Jewish students at the school, there was some tension, of course, and he was always outspoken on the issue of Islam, and whether it was in India certainly, but certainly in the Middle East, because at that time this is the early '70s, and
Mm-hmm.
after that the Yom Kippur War and other things. So
Yes.
so I learned a lot from him. He was younger than we were, but he was very astute on the issue and opened my eyes about the history of that struggle there, the history of how Israel was formed in 1947 and the pressure that was put on the Europeans in the aftermath of World War II with Hitler's atrocious and inhumane treatment of the Jewish population, which we certainly had empathize with and sympathize with for certainly then and even now. But the way that the Palestinian people were treated in the aftermath of that is something that we're still living with to this at this very moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at a map. Michael Jefferson, who you know, did a great article. I think I sent it to you. Did a great piece about this history, and he wasn't being anti-Semitic or anti. He was just trying to tell the truth about the history. So when we talk, so to go into your point, it's important to understand. We understand the history that in
Yes.
1946, if you look at a map, the area that's now is Israel was called Palestine. You look at any world map, it was Palestine. 1947, in the aftermath of Israel being created, is now Israel. So wait a minute. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you go from Palestine to Israel? It was kind of like created as a result of international pressure. All, all well and good. I understand the reasons why and the history behind it. There's no justification or rationale for the violence, the inhumane behavior, treatment, the killing, the murder, the terrorist attacks that have taken place on both sides over the last 60, 70, or 70 years, 70 plus years, 75 years. But the point is that it's important that all of us as Americans, take a step back and try to address the humanity or the inhumanity that's taking place in that part of the world and try to come up with, as best we can, a fair and just resolution. And that there are extreme positions on both sides of this matter. And what I would tell students, to answer your question specifically, is what I just said. Excuse me, to read the history, review the history, understand how this whole matter came into being, the conflict between Israel and not, well, I wouldn't say Israel per se, but the distinction between Zionism and Judaism. I mean, Judaism is religion, Zionism is a political philosophy. We had to understand that, and then sometimes I think those zealots equate the two, and they're like inseparable, and they are separable. And but we had to understand and appreciate the fact that even in our own history, when we had to, if you're gonna be honest with each other, if you look at the early proponents of Zionism, they some of them were supportive of the South African uh, apartheid
Mm-hmm.
uh, political position. If you look and read it and do their reading, they said they took notes on that, applauded it, And so how can you then say, okay, well, we're the people of freedom and religion, freedom and justice for everybody, when your leadership, some of your leadership at that time, was supporting and lifting up the apartheid regime of South Africa. So we have to look at that in terms of, and again, it's very complicated, it's complex. There's a lot of gray area. Now, no clear, no black, no white, a lot of gray. Those require some intensive study and analysis. But all that being said, the tragedy, the human tragedy we're all witnessing, and before our very eyes, is that I heard the number today on CNN that the Palestinian position is that to date, since October the 7th, they have lost over 14,000 people. Mm. Now, just in the Gaza area, 14,000 folks. That's a lot of folk. Mm. And women, a lot of them are women and children. And it's like, what are we talking about here? In 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 14,000 folks have been killed. And the Israeli position is, well, we lost 1,400 on one day. Okay, that was a tragedy, uncalled for, horrendous, horrific, absolutely. But 14,000? I mean, come on, where do we balance this out? Where do we draw the line here? And at some point, and this is where I think America and the European powers, I think, have to step up and say, okay, enough is enough. And because too many human beings are suffering, too many children, women, families on both sides, Jewish and Palestinian. Mm-hmm. So I think as students, whether you Irish, Italian, Jewish, Muslim, Latino, Asian, in America, who are looking at this conflict, have to really study it, analyze it, critique it, and demand that, especially Americans, since billions and billions of our tax money are being sent to buy bombs and tanks and airplanes and going to defense, we can say we have a moral right, a legitimate political right to say, hey, wait a minute, enough is enough here. Let's and I think Biden can, as president. I know it's an election year coming up. He has to be tread carefully with this, but at the same time, he can demand, America can demand that folks sit at the table and work this out. Mm-hmm. America is strategically positioned to say, okay, we can support Israel, which is fine, but at the same time, we from a larger standpoint, as human beings, we got to support humanity here, and what's best for humanity going forward, and we had to and I think that's where we have to go. And my hope is rather, and prayer would be that over the next few months, as we seriously get into the election season, this issue is going to come to the fore. Mm-hmm. Somebody's going to have to make some tough decisions on this, and not be played by the powers that be. And I think so that's how I would look at it. Just study it, analyze it, critique it, understand, appreciate the history, be respectful, and we have to be respectful of the Palestinian position as well as the Israeli position. Mm-hmm. And as human beings, because you know this, you're a student, you've been to school, you're a scholar, that they're the same people. They're the same Semitic people. It's not like these are some strangers coming from, even a lot of Europeans that moved to Israel and that to get out to avoid, to try to avoid anti-Semitism in Europe or certainly in America. We know a lot of Americans there, a lot of Europeans moved there because it's their home. It's a homeland for the Jewish people. I understand that. There's an attraction there. But at the same time, for the most part, the roots are Semitic.
Yeah. There is something or someone called Abraham. So
yeah, somebody. And that's what I heard. And which is, is better than that. We can get into the theological discussion. But I tell this to my students all the time. So if you took, this better than I. If you had a copy of the Quran, the Torah, and the Bible, and certainly the Old Testament of the Bible, it's the same people that are mentioned. Abraham and Abraham, Suleiman, Solomon. They're two different people. They're the same people. And you know this. They're the same folk in all three books. And so wait a minute. So we're talk about the same people in all three books of the major religions on the earth. So what are we doing here? What's going on here? And I think that's the challenge that's been, the challenge we've been facing as human beings for the last couple centuries. No, I mean thousands of years, not I mean millennia.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
how do we address that? How do we reconcile these similarities and differences? You know.
Your point's so well taken. And whether folks view those texts to be literal or anecdotal or just important wisdom storytelling, there is
Yeah.
that Cain and Abel story about
Oh,
brothers early on, early in the Bible,
early on,
early in
first
the
chapter of the Bible, the
early
book.
in the
That's right.
Bible about
Right.
brothers having
Right.
some issues among themselves. So this is I'm your students are really blessed to have you, and I really appreciate when you mentioned the need to kind of sit down at the table, because my mind went to Cliff. If I've mentioned to people since October 6th, October 7th, that the
Yeah.
name Ralph Bunche, and I've
Yes.
asked who is Ralph Bunche, and very few people know or
You're
remember. And
one of the
so,
great Americans of any race that ever walked this earth. Well,
and
yeah.
and then I kind of remind them that he did win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
For what? For trying to resolve that
This,
initial conflict.
I know.
uh, then I mentioned the folks,
Africa got the Nobel Peace Prize for trying to negotiate almost, yeah, 60 years ago. Easily.
yeah,
Yeah, oh, maybe over 60.
yeah, it was a 47, 48
What is
conflict.
it? Yeah, 7 years. Yeah, same thing. To resolve the same issue we're dealing with right now, which is sad.
And
Um,
and so I mentioned that in terms of we often hear about our Black history and our Black genesis, but we've been in the mix for some time. Then lastly, I mentioned to folks, okay, Andy Young. More people know who Andy Young is. They
yeah,
can talk about him, their references to his historical journey. And then I
sure.
mentioned to remember that he was the UN ambassador.
Yeah,
And do you
yeah,
remember why he had to resign?
yeah. That's right.
So,
So,
he tries to reach out to Arafat
that's right.
unofficially. The
Yeah,
press finds out about it, and he has to resign. Then,
right.
lastly, I kind of conclude with, in honor, and not necessarily because President Carter's wife was alive when I've kind of started mentioning it to people, but in
Yeah,
honor of her now, but also the various books that a former president writes about apartheid in Palestine. You have a
yeah.
former president going on the speaking tour, urging people to kind of look at this issue needs to be resolved. So your students are really, really blessed. Let's jump. I want to jump back to Oklahoma on
Yeah.
a historical note. When did, and I ask people this all the time, and people sometimes consider me to be a pain in the butt because I'm always posing these historical questions, but when did Oklahoma become a state?
1907.
So people, guess for people to realize how late Oklahoma and why, because it was not a state, it was somebody else's land prior to that.
Territory. It was officially called until 1907. It was the Oklahoma Indian Territory. So and so just quickly, so the history was, as you know, it was territory, just land. So in the effort, the U.S. government's effort to try to expand this part of this westward expansion, and to get folks to get out of the East and the Midwest and settle this land that they had because they wanted to take it over. And initially, it was land that they designated for the so-called five civilized tribes as part of the Trail of Tears. Because they wanted they wanted the whites, the white government, the white run government, as you know, the United States government wanted the land in Georgia, North Carolina, that the indigenous people were habitating in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. They moved them as part of this Trail of Tears across and settled mainly in Oklahoma, some in Arizona as well, but the Trail of Tears. So in Oklahoma, prior to becoming a state, you had the territory was divided up. Even to this very day, you drive out in Oklahoma, you'll see as you go up and down the highway, the signs will say Creek Reservation, Cherokee Reservation, Seminole Reservation, Choctaw Reservation. So there are five, the so-called five civilized tribes of the Chickasaw, and the Chickasaw was the last one. And so the government decided, well, okay, that's all well and good, but this is land we want whites to settle and to take over. And so they had this land rush, and a lot of people don't talk about this, but there was a land rush. Basically, America basically said,
Mhm.
you just line up, and we're gonna have a race. Wherever you land up or end up, that you can claim that land, and we just gonna give it to you. And that's what they did. And
Mhm.
so fights just kind of took over. And by the way, there were some African Americans too. By the way, you just know this. African
Mhm.
Americans were part of this land rush who settled in what is now ended up becoming the state of Oklahoma, eventually in
Mhm.
1907. But my great grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, it actually was already there, living there with his family, as many other people of African descent who moved there in the aftermath of the Civil War and settled in the Oklahoma so-called Indian territory, and established all black towns
Mhm.
for this big land rush. Black
Mhm.
people were there, and to this very day, you go to Oklahoma, there are towns like Langston, where
Mhm.
Langston College, Langston University is, where my mother attended college, which is an all-black town. Bowley, Taft, among others, that are still all black towns in the state of Oklahoma. Small towns, not wealthy towns, but run by black people
Mhm.
that have been around for over 100. And so so Oklahoma has a very unique and interesting history. In fact, there was a man named Mr. McCabe, I would think, Edwin McCabe, part about history, who basically told, at the time, interesting, long before Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam said to the United States government, let Oklahoma be all black state.
Mhm.
Let all the black people who can't, you don't want us to be in Mississippi, Alabama, New York, Connecticut, come to Oklahoma. We'll run our own place. He basically petitioned the government to to give Oklahoma to black people.
Mhm.
And red man, we live out here together with the red brothers. We'll make it work. Of course, the government said no. But the point is that I was thinking he was thinking of that because if you don't want us to live with you, give us this land. Let us
Mhm.
we'll make it work. We'll farm it. We'll make it work. And as it turned out, I think, of course, the turning point was when oil was discovered in
That's
Oklahoma.
right.
The government said, "Oh heck no, you can't have this land because that's too much money." So that was so a lot of factors there, but oil became a key factor in Oklahoma becoming a state.
Mhm.
When found out there was oil there and oil potential for all this money and resources, they had to hurry up and incorporate it as a state so the government could have some say in those resources. So it's a very interesting history. Absolutely.
And I think hopefully folks, Cliff, will see the connection between, because people will consider that somewhat the crisis in the Middle East today a fight over over land and
Yeah.
migration and settlement and who's going to be in charge. So it's in some ways studying history, you see these motifs that continue to play out, and it does sometimes challenge your one's belief that we as a species can kind of do the Rodney King. Can we all get along? Um,
Yes.
so it is a challenge. Speaking to get along, let's take a little shift about churches.
Okay.
As you referenced, I know a lot of ministers and have been blessed to attend a school that a lot of ministers go to for additional professional education. Let me say that I attended just for more of at that point, as far as I can recall, from a more academic and just exploration of a graduate school and being able to take a variety of courses, but certainly not embarrassed to be at a divinity school where most of my peers were there for a particular professional vocation, but I did not have that in mind. But I say that the school was open to folks, because you do need people in the pews as well as behind the podium to kind of makes organizations survive. But you're involved with a leadership position at Dixwell United Church of Christ and on Dixwell Avenue here in New Haven, one of our historic churches. And I had mentioned before we went on air that I've had a chance to talk to one of your former Reverend Dr. Jerry Streets about some situations. I'm going to do another show with him in a few weeks. Uh, Prior to that, I guess you had Reverend John Henry Scott, and then prior to that, Reverend Edmonds. I don't think you had anyone else. Those have only been the three. Those have been the three ministers. Those
Well,
have
yeah,
been
in the last 60 years, yeah, those three.
those
Yeah,
three. So,
yeah, Reverend Emily John Scott and Reverend Street. Yeah,
and
yeah.
you've known all three, and Reverend Streets has now recently just stepped down and maintaining that he's always been teaching at the divinity school for a number of years, but he has kind of some enhanced responsibilities, and really had a chance to talk about that. But you have a leadership role there, and when churches go through transition, that's a key issue in terms of how does a church, if not reinvent themselves, how do they find the new minister? How do they keep the congregation from coming on a regular basis? There's just so many issues of transition. And given your political experience, given your educational experience, given your just working in this social milieu of the experiment of humanity. I mean, just curious, share with folks your official title, and then what does that role mean? And I'm not looking for you to share any secrets about where you're leading the church to, but I think people need to kind of guess. It's important for all of our churches, particularly today in my mind, to understand whether you have a minister that's new or old, or whether you're in hiatus. This institution is critical, and some would say that it's maybe in hospice or stage 5 or
Yeah.
stage 1. So for the survival of our churches in general, but particularly for the survival of and thrival of our Black churches, just curious your thoughts about that in terms of your particular position now.
Well, thank you, thank you. I think it is important. I agree, and it's a challenging time, I believe, for churches generally, um, but certainly the Black church for any number of reasons. So, Dixwood Avenue United Church of Christ. Well, Dixwood Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ. For those who don't know, and there's a lot of confusion on this. The Dixwood Avenue Church is part of a predominantly white denomination. The Congregational Church is one of the oldest church denominations in America. Been around for hundreds of years, as you know. And Dixwood Avenue, we go back and forth with Faith, UCC, and Hartford. We claim it's the oldest historically Black congregation within the United Church of Christ in America, founded in 1820, which makes us 200 and almost 204 years old. And so, and because of that unique history, founded by a young Yale, in fact, seminarian, Simeon Jocelyn, and African Americans some who were formerly who escaped slaves, and some who were free men and women here in New Haven, formed the Temple Street church, which is where the Temple Street Garage is now downtown, and later moved to Dixwood Avenue. It's been around a long time, and from the very beginning of the church, being founded in 1820, as you know, Simeon Johnson was an abolitionist, of course, and he was very outspoken on issues of racial equality. He led the charge to even get the first Black college established here, the first Black college in America established here in New Haven. Of course, it was voted down for like 500 to 0, 500 to 4. It was a ridiculous vote because people had to vote for it. People in New Haven had to vote. White men who could vote. Only white men could vote with property. And they voted against him. But he had the courage to lead that charge, in the hope, thinking that even though Yale was here and well established, that it'd be nice to have a college for Black men to attend and become educated and contribute to America. But beyond that church has a long history of being involved with the Amistad captives in 1839, and certainly and beyond, in every major social issue, challenge rather, that New Haven faced. A lot of the leadership of doing things, positive things in New Haven and in Connecticut came out of that church with these last 200 years. And certainly Doc Edmonds was instrumental in the last 60 years in making that happen. Reverend Scott did his part, did his fair share. He's a teacher now at Gateway. Reverend Streets, who you mentioned, who succeeded him a long time, with the first African American chaplain at Yale, great scholar, administrator there at the Divinity School, former pastor in Bridgeport and here in New Haven. So we have an older person. I think he was an older person as well, like you, for a while. So he kind of was a mentee, like I am, of Reverend Edmonds, and certainly left a great legacy in Dixwell. So where we are now, Reverend Streets decided to retire back in September of this year. And so presently, our church, like many other churches, is facing a major challenge in finding a replacement, a new pastor to succeed Reverend Streets, in a very difficult time when every statistic I've seen indicates that the churches generally, and even Black churches in some cases, are losing members. We have a couple of generations of folk who, not that they're anti-religious, they may be just anti-church, anti-establishment church because of social media and just I guess an enlightening of sorts. And then maybe there's a sense that a lot of these young people see in many ways the hypocrisy and the shortcomings of institutional church life. They see, materialism. They see that again. I mentioned the hypocrisy. I think, and it's a turnoff in many ways to some. There are some churches that are doing well, but those who relate to young people and can speak their language and bring them in. But we face as an older church, an older congregation, as most United Church of Christ are. I mean, congregational churches are rather. We have a major challenge in front of us in terms of finding a leader, male or female, quite frankly, who can come in and re-energize our base and bring in new members, make the church more relevant than it is right now. And that's something we have to work on. But I don't think it's we any different than many other churches what we hear these days. But it's a major challenge for us for sure.
And
But
share with folks your title, Cliff, because again, I mentioned.
Yeah, I'm the so in the United Church of Christ hierarchy, bureaucracy. There's the minister, of course, the minister of the church, who's the leader, obviously, and then there's a position called moderator. Interesting term, moderator, but it's the elected position. So the congregation elects the moderator, who's kind of sort of. You look at the structure, like kind of like second in charge after underneath the minister. Then there are deacons and missionary board and finance board, other trust, remember other leaders of the church. We have a church council that's elected that basically serves as basically the church leadership. But the moderator convenes the church council, is the head of the church council, and speaks for the church in many respects, and is kind of ex officio head of the church in the absence of a pastor. So a lot of now in the wake of Reverend Street's retirement, a lot of the leadership responsibility does fall on my shoulders, but it's a collective leadership. I made it clear to my fellow members that I appreciate and I'm honored and humbled by this honor they bestowed on me. But it's going to take all of us collectively to move this forward. And since I grew up in that church, I've been a member of that church since I was a teenager. Folks have actually seen me, many of them grow up and supported me along the way. So I'm fortunate in that regard, and that people who in church, listen, you mentioned politics. So having been involved in electoral politics, been involved in academic politics at several universities, and certainly church politics, I got to tell you, church politics may be the most devious of all. You think it would be the most humane, but so church politics can be tough. I got to tell you, and anybody who's been involved in churches can say amen to that. It's difficult sometimes to and we had a guest speaker a few weeks ago. I won't mention her name, but you know her very well, who said that she had been in the ministry over 40 years. She said, I learned the difference between Christians and church folk. And she said, there's a distinction between Christians and church folk. And she said, the longer I've been around, the more I can't stand church folk. So this is a pastor speaking. Because what the connotation is that people, church folk, involved in politics, get involved in petty politics. I'm sorry. Hold on. So Tom, I'm sorry. Get involved in petty politics. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Tom? Okay, I'm sorry. Get involved in petty politics. Because we're all human beings. So you start with that assumption that or presumption that we're all human beings. We all have our shortcomings and frailties. But the hope would be, and no matter what entity you're in, whether it's in a church, whether it's in a college setting, or even in the board of elders chambers, that the humanity of folks will rise. The best of people will come, but will rise to the top, and that you will, and that will help guide and lead us in the right direction. And I'm bringing that same attitude, and certainly, I would say my experience as a judge has been very helpful and instructive, and in my temperament as well, in terms of dealing with the different points of view, the internal arguments and disagreements we may have that will continue until this matter is settled. But that's what we have to do. And for whatever reason or reasons, I sit back and try to analyze, well, why is it that I got put in this position at this point in my life? Well, sometimes you say, well, whatever reason, the good Lord decided, well, this is your next task.
Mm.
Here's your
Hmm.
next assignment. So just do the best you can, be the best you can be, meet the challenge, and as long as you're fair and honest with people, then even if they disagree with you, they can't fault you um, for being for being fair and honest.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And I appreciate your referencing that because when folks, um, just in terms of your location, you hear this thing about real estate values, location,
Yes,
location, location. But if we consider where you're located with the Concord Plaza kind of coming up with adjacent, you guys are adjacent and abut the Q House and
yes,
the library and the health center. And then just behind you, you have Wexford Grant School. And I
yes,
think even if you go in the Wexford Grant School, there's a plaque when Wexford Grant was built of current board people, Board of Education folks, and I believe your father's name is on that plaque. And then
absolutely.
beyond that school, you also have
Right.
Leonard Jihad is doing his anti-violence work, uh, and not to mention Varick Church, right, adjacent to you, and Hannah Gray Home, and the Bethel um,
That's right.
housing that's going up, and the Elks are moving down the street. So there's a lot of fertile energy, planned, economic, spiritual, material, educational, community building. So your role, the role of the church, and it's positioned as you say, you're around since the 1800s. That
Indeed.
that monopoly board of Dixwell, not to mention that the old Monterey, there's going to be some development there. So it's just
Right.
so key for if a minister is looking to kind of come. And I presume, Cliff, your church, your search is nationwide.
Yeah, we haven't started yet. We're going to have some preliminary discussions, but the most it would be we've been in contact with the United Church of Christ leadership
Right.
locally, and they're willing, and of course they understand and they appreciate the history of Dixwell and Dixwell's um, role historically in that denomination. So they're more than willing to assist us in that. And so, but the short answer is yeah, it would most likely would be a nationwide search, and it's interesting because we this past summer we were in Washington. We had a church excursion to Washington D.C. to the African American History Museum,
Mm-hmm.
and we were there for the weekend. So on that Sunday we attended as a church, People's United Church of Christ, People's Congregation United Church of Christ in D.C., which is one of the oldest and established churches in Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Back and they were that church even in Washington D.C. is having a similar challenge we're facing. They have an interim pastor because
Mm.
their pastor retired. So and the congregation there was saying they have even they're in D.C. with a much larger, as you know, African American population than New Haven for sure, and long history as well. That they having a difficult time,
Mm.
right, and many challenges. So we weren't necessarily heartened by that, but certainly gave us a realistic assessment of where we are and where we have to go. And right, dude, but your point about Dixwell, and we were very much aware of the fact that in New Haven a lot of rumors are spread about Yale's gonna buy up everything. Yale is gonna own Concord. Yale owns the Q House. Yale owns gonna buy up Dixwell Church. And so, but these are unfounded, but it's part of the paranoia we think we have. And sometimes I think I think is sometimes is Maya Angelou used to say sometimes we have a healthy paranoia about some things and be cognizant of and be careful of in terms of what we do and how we move forward. But I do think that there's a unique opportunity for us. You're right. And with this I'm calling it the revitalization, and I say this
Yes,
to every
it's a renaissance, absolutely.
this, and that's what I've said as much to. I'm going to agree with you. I said as much to both Eric Clemens and Carlton Highsmith, the Concord. It is a renaissance, and rightfully so. I think they're rightfully characterizing it that way. And with the Q House, you're right. With the Q House, with the health center, with the library there, with the Concord development right across the street from the church there is in the center of all this. In the center of all this, the new development is going to take place. So whatever, and I think it's a great opportunity for whoever minister we bring in to be a part of that,
Mm-hmm.
to opportunity to say, hey, we want to be a part of this effort, and we've said as much, or articulated as much to the Concord leadership and to the leadership of the Q House. that we're partners in this. Dixwell, as you know, some people may not know, but Dixwell Church actually gave the land to create the first Q house over
Hmm.
almost years ago. And so
Hmm.
the house that was further up Dixwell Avenue, 100 Dixwell Avenue, the land that the Q house is built on belonged to Dixwell Church. So there's a interconnection
Hmm.
to historic connection between those two entities for sure. And then of course the Concord development across the street now, which will all provide all type of opportunities for the church to be engaged in, and then all the development down further down Dixwell. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's something we need to we're cognizant of and embrace, and we'll continue to work in conjunction with the leadership of that area to as we move forward.
Again, and with Varick Church as well. So there are
Yeah,
a lot of players around, and just the historic the historic existence of Varick. Cliff, for the next 8 or 9 minutes, I want to wind down and want to go back to the gunnery, because not necessarily because, but it's something that's important to me and what you mentioned. A friend of mine named Charles Bush. I graduated from the school here in Wallingford. At that time, it was called Choate. Now it's Choate Rosemary Hall.
oh
And
yeah.
as an aside, I'm the oldest Black graduate from Choate as we speak.
Is that right?
I was number two and number three position, but the number one, number two, they kind of went on to the higher happy ground. And so I say that not as a boast, but just as a fact. And so
Yeah.
that reality also is in my mind. So
Congratulations.
Charles Bush, who graduated a few years later,
Yeah.
went to Harvard. He's doing an archival search at Choate, and I've asked him to kind of expand his focus about what was going on in terms of board meetings in the 60s and 70s about this great migration, this influx of Black students. And he's found some very interesting documents from some of the board meetings, um,
Interesting.
about integration. And I've asked him kind of to reach out to people like yourself and others, because he believes that story. His intention is he believes the story of our existence and our participating in that historical period is important. I've kind of pushed back to him. I said, oh, well, so what? You go to school, you go to school, you go to school. But he feels there's some historical relevance to documenting your experience, my experience, his experience at those on those plantations, on those reservations, on those so-called elite institutions at that point in time. Any
I
feeling
agree.
about that?
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's great because it's interesting because well, you being at show, I was at the Den Gunnery, and then like Jerry Glover, Teddy Glover's son, when it was at Westminster, um, uh, um, Frank Borges was at Westminster,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and so you have a lot of New Haven brothers who, well, folks who are now in New Haven rather, who went to these schools who are still around. And Jerry Dover and I shared, from who went to Westminster, he shared a story with me similarly that he went to a reunion, and how the folks just gravitated, his fellow white classmates gravitated to him, and expressed their appreciation for him being there at the time they were there. Who
Mm-hmm.
helped educate them about the Black experience. And then of course now what Jerry's doing, he's got a scholarship fund going. He got some other things going on to get for other students of color to attend Westminster. So I think, and I'm sure Charles will find stories like that. But there was some pushback, as you know, from when I entered the gunnery in 1969. The class, we had more Black students in my class than had ever attended the school. So but it was the year after Dr. King was assassinated. So the
Mm-hmm.
door opened just a little wider for us then. But it created some tension
Mm-hmm.
for among the white students who had never attended school with anybody of color in all the schools they had attended.
Right.
Never been in close contact with. So it was a culture shock for them as well as it was for us. And there was some tensions that evolved from there with us and even some of the faculty members. So I think whatever Charles, your colleague finds, I think will be interesting for all of us in terms of what was going on in those board meetings, what was being said, and about us coming in and to these institutions. Um, and I know you got to go, but just one quick story. I think I may have told you this before, and it's something that opened my eyes coming from the South. I mean, as I said earlier, growing up in the Jim Crow South and during the Civil Rights era and drinking from the colored fountain and going to the colored bathroom and sitting in the colored section of the movie theater on the bus, and then coming to Connecticut and even though things were beginning to change when we left, um, and then but thinking growing up in the South, because you hear all these wonderful things. Well, you hear all these all the not the rumors, but the fictional stuff about the North. Oh wait, North is so much better. People treat you right. They speak to you. They treat you with dignity and respect. And so we said, okay. So my first year at the gunnery, after again with the largest student conglomeration of Black students to ever attend the school, we started getting these notes in our mailboxes with people on nooses, with hanging from nooses in our mail. And so we all of us were looking around and saying, well, who could be doing this? And we knew there was a small contingent of white students from the South who were at the gunnery. And so we automatically pointed the finger at them. It had to be them. It had to be the kids from Tennessee and Virginia who were doing this because that's what they're accustomed to. And then they certainly want to go to school with us. But long and short of it is the school was concerned about this, of course, obviously, and conducted an investigation. And they found out ultimately the person who was the ringleader was from Naugatuck, Connecticut. And so we're like, huh? Connecticut? Nobody from Connecticut do this. And not only was he from Naugatuck, Connecticut, but his father was the chairperson of the board of trustees.
Yep.
And so we said, oh, so for all of us, and there were several of us from the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina myself, and then even those from Chicago and Detroit and New Haven, were like, it opened our eyes. And, oh, this racism thing, this injustice thing is not confined to the South and how they feel about us. That even in little Naugatuck, Connecticut, feel the same way. And so for me, when I said a culture shock and an eye-opening experience, and to this very day, that's why I bring that up to you right now. Open my eyes about the complicity and the intrinsic nature of injustice and racism, how it's taught and perpetuated in society. And finally, in terms of not just this guy being the head of the board of trustees, he was the president and CEO of Peter Paul, Almond Joy, and Mahasa. To this day, Tom, I had not eaten a Peter Paul, Almond Joy, or to this day. From that day to this day, I refuse to buy an Almond Joy to this day. Because his son inherited the place. Most likely, he was the state buyer. I said I would never buy Peter Palmer. So long as, but the point I made, the bigger issue, of course, is that it was eye opening. So those experiences, going back to your point about Mr. Bush, and I imagine whether it was Choate or Westminster or Taft or Exeter, all these schools that trained a lot of the leaders of this country in business and politics to this very day, that some of those attitudes still prevail. And so, but that's all the reason why it was important that we be at those schools to see it firsthand, witness it firsthand, experience it firsthand, which I think made us better people and more enlightened about American society. I'm grateful for that. Absolutely.
Judge Graves, thank you so much. I know you had to retire when you were 70, but you're still judge, in my mind, and you've been trying to create peace and harmony and equity in the world even before you became the probate judge. And we didn't get a chance to talk about your story when you were 9 years old and saw MLK, but that's for the next. I kind of conclude on that. That's for our next show. I'd like to, needless to say, I want to do it again, and I'm thinking for January for us to kind of begin to talk about Black History Month and Black Genesis Month, et cetera. Thank you so much. Be well, be safe.
You do the same.
All right.
Thank you for your service. You take care of yourself, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas and experiences. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks, Tom. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Same to you.